While the Texas Rangers had been granted limited law enforcement authority in the late 19th century with which they honed their skills as frontier lawmen, the 20th century brought new breeds of criminals and more urbanized crime. As a result, in 1901, the Frontier Battalion was disbanded and reconstituted as the Ranger Force under new legislation that gave all Rangers full law enforcement authority and peace officer status. The new Ranger Force was smaller than its predecessor, often consisting of as few as 30 men, privates and officers combined. Nevertheless, they found themselves assigned to respond to a wide variety of criminal activity. They maintained order in oil boom towns, during labor disputes, defended the border with Mexico, enforced prohibition, and chased down modern gangsters. They traded their horses for motor cars and adopted the investigative tools and techniques that were emerging at the time. It was a transition that was oftentimes plagued by undue political influence and related controversies. And though, despite such hurdles, the Rangers endured and evolved. They asserted themselves as a state law enforcement body at a time when many local authorities resented such an intrusion, a perspective often shaped by local attitudes and practices that ran counter to state laws. From their enforcement of state gambling and liquor laws to protecting the border from incursions by revolutionaries and bandits, the challenges of the time led some Texans to question the Rangers' role.
In particular, those in the South Valley saw the Rangers as oppressors rather than law enforcement.
While certain Rangers may have at times committed questionable acts, scholars have found that such events were not representative of the force as a whole.
The Rangers find themselves mostly on the other side of that coin because they're defending minorities from lynch mobs, from summary justice.
Vigilantism is when regular citizens try to exact justice against an accused criminal outside of the established court system. It had long been a problem in Texas that many locally elected officials struggled to deal with in the face of their constituents' sympathy with such acts during the early 20th century. And since the Texas Rangers were not subject to the whims of local voters or officials, they were seen as better equipped to respond to such issues. Most notably, Rangers were frequently sent to protect the lives and due process rights of criminal defendants, including minorities, the most frequent victims of such efforts during this period from lynch mobs. Unfortunately, it was a Jim Crow era, a time when many ethnic minorities were socially and legally marginalized, and when racial animosity was acute and pervasive across the United States. Therefore, despite the Rangers' best efforts, they were not always successful at stemming the tide of racial hostility in such instances, particularly when the alleged victim was a white female, and when their passions were stoked by false and exaggerated claims of the alleged offense. Such was the case with Sherman in 1930, a small yet ostensibly cosmopolitan community in North Texas.
One case in point, Sherman in May of 1930, there's an African-American defendant who's accused, as many were, of raping a white woman. And at the trial, a lynch mob shows up. And here you have Frank Hamer and two Rangers with him using tear gas, firing shotguns into this crowd to save the life of this black defendant. Ultimately, they were not successful. 5,000 people, I mean, one riot, one Ranger doesn't really apply when you've got 5,000 people burning down the courthouse. And in fact, when it was done, Frank Hamer said he'd never go back to Sherman. He cursed the town of Sherman to the end of his days.
The Rangers did not let Hughes die in vain. However, as they incorporated the lessons learned from that tragic event into their policies and practices, they furthered the process of their evolution into modern lawmen. A new generation of Ranger commanders emerged to lead the Rangers in the next phase of their evolution from frontier defenders into peacekeepers and law enforcement investigators. The legendary Captain Frank Hamer stands as a leading example of the prototypical Texas Ranger of his era, who worked to enforce the rule of law and support the fragile legal system of the time. In addition to Hamer, the Rangers of the early 20th century evolved into modern lawmen under the leadership of notable commanders such as John Rogers, John Hughes, Will Wright, Roy Aldrich, William Sterling, Manuel Lone Wolf Gonzalez, James McCormick, and many others. It was a process that culminated in 1935 with their adoption into a newly created state law enforcement body named the Department of Public Safety. Formed at the behest of newly elected Governor James V. Allred and modeled on the most advanced state law enforcement agencies of the time, the new DPS positioned the Texas Rangers as the elite state investigative arm, a role that they thrived in and sought to perfect for generations to come.